Welcome, everyone, to the Disruptive Jam. My name is Carrie Forbes, and I am your resident DJ, that's Disruptive Jammer, and really happy to have you join me on this podcast. It's a place where we get to talk about all of the things that surprise us, that throw us off, but also become our opportunities. So let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Disruptive Jam. And today, our episode is titled Siren Songs. This is about women who have disruptive voices, who maybe push against what society considers the status quo and maybe are a little bit dangerous. Today, we've got two wonderful guests with us. First is Michelle Poole, an entrepreneur and owner of Deep Poole Consulting. And I also have Maria Parcur, Associate Professor of Finance and the Vice Chair of the Senate at Dalhousie University. Just a little bit about those two and their connection to myself. We are also all co-founders of a new organization called Finclusive Edge, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Welcome to the Disruptive Jam, folks, and today's episode I have called Siren Songs. Now, before I introduce you to our guest today, there's a little definition of what a siren really is. So if you are aware of the myth, the sirens were very dangerous women that used to lure sailors, and they were considered very powerful. But the modern version of a siren, when we think about those women, they are disruptors. They are people that still have a voice that really matters, but maybe are seen as dangerous, maybe are seen as disruptive. And I love those people. So we're going to get into that today. And with me, I have Maria Parcur, who is a professor at Dalhousie University. And I have Michelle Poole, who is an entrepreneur and payment expert. And you have me that somehow fits in this mix. So I'm going to just jump right in because I have so many questions and you're going to get to know their background as we get going. But I'm going to start with you first, Maria. So I want you to take me back to where you grew up in Romania. And when I think about being a siren and I think about a voice, what was having a voice or what was the concept of that like for you growing up? How did you see the world in terms of what you could say?
Well, hello. First of all, thank you for having us. It's always such a pleasure to spend time with you and Michelle. So as you mentioned, I grew up in Romania, and actually I was 14 when the revolution happened. So my first 14 years of life, I lived under communism. So speaking up there was very different because it was often, or most of the time, very risky. However, as a child and teen, I was protected, I think, by the environment, my parents, the school environment as much as possible. So I didn't really feel like I had the freedom of expression restricted because I was really too young. However, my parents were very severe parents, and they instilled in my sister and I, discipline and value of hard work. So I think that for us, they basically taught us that integrity comes first and a voice second. And we have even a saying in Romania that a child is to be seen, not to be heard. But this is how I learned, I think, the value of words. Words are very important to me. And I learned that they have a lot of weight because you don't use words unless you are really willing to stand behind them. So for me, voice developed quite early as a responsibility, not as a loudness. And I think that I took that with me through my entire path to Canada and even in my career.
Oh, wow. When you just said that, it's a responsibility, not a loudness. Wow. And I think about today, we got a lot of loud people, but I'm not sure we necessarily see the responsibility to that all the time. But, I'm going to turn it to you, Michelle, because I know you grew up in Nova Scotia like I did. But of course, everybody has different paths. And I'm curious what your experience may be in growing up, say, Gen X 90s kind of gal like I was. What was your voice when you were growing up?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. What I also find very interesting is as Maria talks about your past, and I think, I knew Carrie was going to ask me probably my perspective and kind of the similarity on that. But even though you grew up in Romania under communism and I grew up in, Nova Scotia, the interesting thing for me is that there are some similarities. So to answer your question, at our table, at our kitchen table, the voice that my parents encouraged me to have was a very thoughtful, considered voice. And I learned too about the importance of words, because the way it worked on our table is that if you wanted to come to the table, you could say anything you wanted, but it had to be said not from a place of emotion and not from a place of grandstanding or loudness. It had to be with fact. You had to be respectful in presenting of that opinion, but you had to have actual rationale that wasn't at all emotional based to have that conversation. And I could have it in a very passionate sort of a way, but it had to be very informed. And so I just find that there's similarities there with us, even though actually probably brought up in a very different kind of an environment. And the other thing I think is really interesting is that, you're talking about this siren metaphor. And, I think it's very apropos. I think oftentimes, women's voices that aren't aligned with the status quo are classified as that siren kind of a song and that siren kind of a voice. Yet oftentimes that's how we actually make forward progress, is when you are challenging that status quo.
It's so interesting because, again, the parallels there around when I look at it, it's about this question of appropriateness, but there's also a bit of a boundary push there that you're talking about. And I wonder, at what point have you been told you're too much? Michelle, I see you grin there. I start with that one. When did you get that line, and what does that look like?
Well, I find it so interesting that that's where you go to about being told too much. Because of course, yes, I have been told I've been too much. I don't know that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it happened oftentimes in school. It happened oftentimes when I was misperceived. I've often been underestimated, and I've turned that into my strength, because if you're underestimated, it's really easy to knock it out of the park, right? Because people don't get you. And so lots of times I'm not gotten, shall we say, right? And I would say, like, even in a workspace, often a new client will hire me, and they'll hire me to do something that's small, just X, because, I've been recommended or referred that, hey, she knows what she's doing, she could do this. Then they're quite surprised because I've over-delivered and I've really knocked something out of the park and identified, hey, there's this other opportunity. We could go take care of this, or we could tackle this. And so then that kind of leads to this bit of a surprise, and I've used it as a strength. And so, yeah, I've been told I'm too much. I'm not everybody's cup of tea, but hey, I'm a glass of champagne. So, there you have it. That's honestly what I often will say. And it's not, and I think the important thing too, though, is because, kind of taking it back to that siren metaphor. You were talking about the siren song distracting ships, and the ability to take the ships off course, right? I don't see my siren song as being about that. I see my siren song as, providing direction and guiding the ships. And it's not about loudness. It's not at all. It's more about inclusivity, making sure you have all of the voices and representing them. And yeah, it takes a certain kind of a skill set, maybe a personality, to be able to do that, especially if there's a lot of differing opinions. And so maybe that could be perceived as too much.
Could be. And I think that's the question, is who determines that, right?
That's
right.
The question.
So Marie, I know, and you have been self-described many times as outspoken. And
it wasn't necessarily a compliment, I found out.
So that, I'm curious, what does that, when you're using your voice, and I love the way Michelle frames it, right? But not to be loud, right? Not in that way, but maybe to open up this world. But then you get that pushback.
So for me, I've always spoken up. And that was, I think it's something that I took from my dad. My dad was always very, very vocal. And actually, I remember as a child, my mom was very worried with my aunt because my dad and my uncle, they would get close in a room and listen to Free Europe radio with all the windows shut down and whispering by fear of the militia and all that. But I honestly, I sometimes wish I was different because speaking up really, I feel there were moments where I had to pay for it. However, it served me well. I think that I just have something that triggers me. The minute I see something that feels unethical or feels unjust, I feel the need to speak up. So it served me well in the past. It got me to where I am. I think, people respected me for that. I was class representative. Then I was representative of international students. I got scholarships, not just because of speaking up, of course, but I think I had gained the respect of my peers. Once I started my professional career and having a job, that's when I kind of realized that maybe not everyone is like that. And I remember when I visited your offices back in the past at League Data, and on the wall, there were many personal quotes, and one of them was, "Bring yourself to work." And I almost had tears because to me, that's actually authenticity. It's one of the values that I cherish a lot. And I remember last year I gave the convocation address for the students who graduated at Dalhousie in commerce. And I referred to the difference between eology and resume virtues. And I focused on these two eology virtues, standing up for justice and authenticity, because they are really, really dear to my heart. But not all leaders are like you, Carrie. So for me, one of the shocks was that just because I say what I mean, it doesn't mean that everyone does the same. So I had my fair share of disappointments. And I think that at some point, actually, people, I remember I had colleagues who told me, well, maybe you are not liked, but you are respected. And I think that I take that. Actually, one of my favorite quotes is, aim for respect, not affection. And of course, as you know, we are all social animals. I want to be liked. I want to be, pleasant. But I take respect. And I think that people realize that using my voice is because I'm passionate about something, and they actually count on me to use my voice. So I literally had people who came to me and told me, I was really hoping you would speak up. And I was like, why wouldn't you? So I think I took for granted the fact that, I thought that everyone uses their voice and it's just something normal, until I realized that a lot of people are actually afraid of doing it. And that's something that still is puzzling to me.
Well, I think you said it so well there a moment ago. And to me, this is the essence of, I think, where that siren line is really challenging, which is we all want to be liked. And yet sometimes when you're doing the right thing, you have to push, right? And I think sometimes for women, we really struggle through socialization or whatever that looks like, that part of our value is to be liked over maybe making waves in that way. And so you've both kind of tackled that in a really diplomatic way, which I thought was really great. But I'm curious, as we dig a little bit on this idea of, okay, sometimes I have to get really uncomfortable and I have to choose this strength or this over my comfort to stay liked or to do that. But I'm curious about if there's a particular, instance or story that where you've had to really kind of manage that. And I think for myself, just to share really briefly, one of the biggest moments for me was being able sometimes to make really big decisions about people where you knew, maybe you're in a CEO role, for example, and you have to maybe fire somebody. And maybe it's for a particular reason that not everybody sees. And all they see is all of the external, but not all the rationale underneath it. But you still have to carry that. And then you carry with it the weight of those opinions. Sometimes I think those things often are some of the factors that makes it even harder to say, here's what I want to tell you, or here's my story, or here's what you need to know. So with that, I'm just curious, Michelle, do you have any thoughts or any stories on that from, especially I'd say, your experiences in a very male-dominated kind of industry like payments?
Fair. I think, having been in payments, I've had the very good fortune of working on some pretty big, large initiatives that were, Canada-wide or, and also actually global in nature. And sometimes behind the scenes, there's a lot that goes on and decisions get made and there's some politics, right? And sometimes you make, as a leader, you make the decisions for progress and not so much for optics. And I think that's really the key. And you can't, it's always all about the storytelling. So there's always a story to everything that you do, whether it's a decision, a program, a product gets launched, whatever that is, there's a story. And so as a leader, you're thinking through what that's going to be. But what served me well, again, interestingly, is that authenticity. But what I've always tried to do in difficult situations like that is get all of the stakeholders understanding what is our objective, what is the goal. And if we can all kind of align against that, and then I'll build a coalition of support from both internal and external, knowing that everything might not be popular and that the decision could have some negative optics to it. And then some small wins. So even if it's a pilot, a test, a situation where there's some small wins, because in payments, a lot of things that, I'll say the standard business, small business, or consumer might see might not make sense. And behind the scenes, there's an entire ecosystem that if you're in it and you're living and breathing that ecosystem, it might make sense, but sometimes it might not. And you're not at liberty to actually explain everything because there's a lot of confidentiality involved in a lot of the decisions and the rationale and all of the moving parts. So that's how I've, found there to be some success in staying true in a very authentic way. And, ensuring that there's authenticity, but having some of those quick wins so that you can prove out, the idea or the case point to be able to have some results to then continue with the momentum. And I think all leaders, have to have a bit of I'll call it a bit of a thick skin, because sometimes the decisions you make aren't always popular. And to your point, I think women think about that a lot more than men do. But it just is.
And I think, when we tie this up, a lot of times women as leaders are expected to nurture, right, in many cases, and provide a lot of not just the business, but the HR piece and that can be very, very difficult when you're wearing that hat. And it can be hard to stay true to that authentic self trying to juggle all of that. Now, and I'm curious, Maria, in the academic world, when you think about that line of when do I use that voice? But what about, similar to Michelle, like, when you find yourself having to kind of step into that, what does it look like for you?
Many times I felt very uncomfortable. I never really seen myself as a leader, even though if I look back and I try to kind of ignore the imposter syndrome that I think we all women at some point suffer more or less. I think I was always pushed towards speaking up and taking the lead on different initiatives. But in the workplace, I had many moments where I felt very conflicted because the way I was raised, again, the values from my parents, what I took from my roots is, respect of authority. And for me, authority is very important. And I found myself in several situations, unfortunately, the context was like that, where the people in authority were not necessarily the people demanding most respect. And then I was very conflicted because I had to speak up and disagree openly because I felt if I don't do it, nobody would. But at the same time, this is the authority that you are supposed to be respecting and maybe, not necessarily disagreeing so formally and openly. So it took me, like I suffered quite a bit. You say thick skin. I think I had to get a little bit of that. And I had moments where I was thinking, Maria, why do you have to always be the one to point out, things that are not ethical? But when I had colleagues coming to me after a meeting or after something controversial and telling me, I was hoping you would speak up. I'm so glad you did. And, 10-year professors. And I was on probationary appointment. Probationary appointment means that you are judge assessed after 2 years and they can basically decide not to renew you. For me, there was no difference that I'm on probationary tenured or on tenure track. I always spoke regardless of my appointment. But then I had people who were saying, well, we understand if you are in a contract, you don't speak out. So I think that to me was, again, I come back to that as I reflect now. I didn't realize actually how shocking that was to me. But now that I think about it, really lots of people, and I find myself saying, I understand if staff members don't say anything because they might lose their job. But I think we find so many explanations. And sometimes we find ourselves as bystanders. And I think that what pained me was that as bystanders, we have a choice. Do we use our voice? We can use our voice and break the silence, or we can keep the silence. And to my shock, a lot of people found that it's just easier to keep the silence.
Oh, such a good point. And my gosh, there's a few things you both have said that are just kind of all swirling here. But I think the biggest thing that stands out is that you need to be authentic. You have to be yourself because you can't, you're not, to your point.
I try not to be authentic. I swear to God, I try to play politics. I try to polish my language. I try to be diplomatic. And it worked so badly. I think people just got used to who I am. And I have people who come and tell me, after a Senate meeting, people I don't even know. I know you from Senate. I always appreciate the things you say. You are always bringing up things that nobody dares. So I was like, you know what? Maybe there is something good in what I'm doing, and maybe I do have a purpose.
And I think that's the thing we're modeling. And just like you were talking about, Michelle, the approach that you're taking with this group and that. But I think this is where that Siren piece fits in, is that we're battling. I like that bystander all the time. It's a great way to think about it. I could stand here and I could jump in with what I know and what I believe. Do I take that risk? And I think that's what's so interesting is both of you are doing that, right? A lot. And probably not even recognizing the modeling that's happening. So I kind of want to move this a little bit around to what that voice means. So I want you to think about, I believe you both have daughters. And so if we think about whether they're daughters or sons or children, coming up into this world and thinking about how did they embrace their voice? What are some of the things you've learned on your journey that you might share? Maybe I'll start with you, Michelle.
Well, I think your point about modeling is really key. My daughter is very entrepreneurial in nature, and she's already had a couple of businesses. She currently has a couple of side hustles. I mean, So I guess, your point about modeling is certainly well taken. The thing I think as well is it kind of goes back to the table I talked about when I was growing up and the way my parents brought me up. I did, follow some of that with my daughter. And so my daughter constantly comes to the table with ideas, with new perspectives, with things that are happening in her culture, in her age group that she shares with me, that I wouldn't have that window into that if, she didn't have that ability and that safe space to come to the table to say things. Because, I learn from her all the time. And I find that incredibly valuable because as a leader, I lead people from all different walks of life, all different age groups, backgrounds, all of that. And so I find the fact that she shares that with me is very helpful for me as a leader. I think that it's really challenging growing up as a female and a young leader and in today's society. I think that, there is this desire to be able to be your authentic self and to, come to work and be authentic. And I think more and more the younger generation, we're seeing that, and they're very comfortable to do that. But at the same time, I think it's a bit of a trial and error, and you learn of some of the challenges that come with that, because sometimes it can be isolating for young females to come to work or to, be their authentic self. And unfortunately, it's not popular. And sometimes if it's not popular, it ends up being isolated. When I was a kid and growing up, things like being neurodiverse wasn't really talked about when I was growing up. Now, with my daughter and her friend group, that's as normal as it's talked about. It's widely understood. It is like, honestly, it's so mainstream and accepted. And I think that's so key and so important, because again, we get to have all voices and perspectives at the table. And I think today's leaders understand that all voices matter. Right? Not just the loud one, not just those siren songs, all of them.
So if we're silent,
yeah,
then we're not modeling, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Maria, you model all the time as a professor. And so I want you to kind of look at this from that perspective when you think about how, and you often have guests coming in and speaking, what does this kind of an influence have on those minds?
I'm very grateful for that opportunity, actually. I don't think I was so aware when I started of the potential influence I can have. It's only when female students came, even after they graduated, to tell me how important it was that I did something, even when occasionally you would have, guest speakers who maybe would be a little bit macho. And then I would ask questions, and I would bring, the women perspective. I think that for me, it's very important that students understand that they do have a voice, because, again, I was so disappointed with so many people not using their voice, when them using their voice would have made such a huge difference on people's lives. So silence really can be very, very damaging. So my students know that they have a voice, and I want them to know that their voice matters. And that's why I get often... I get comments, and in the evaluations, Maria loves debates, loves discussion, be prepared to come and discuss. And they feel comfortable sharing their points of view with me. But I also want them to understand that, even though we are in finance, some people might think, oh, I'm not a doctor, I'm not going to kill anyone to my job. Well, I want them to understand that their decisions in the financial industry can have dramatic impacts. Think about the global financial crisis. Think about so many events. So I want them to understand that their decisions can have rippling effects beyond just the balance sheet, and that we all have a responsibility. So I think even when I was a young kid, I wanted to be a teacher. So I think that if I look back, my voice, I think it was always about teaching and fairness. And I feel really, really privileged that I get to share that with my students. And whether they are male or female, I find them extremely supportive. And occasionally I had students who would come and say, oh, thank you so much for saying this or that. And then I would share my vulnerabilities, and they would be shocked. They would say, oh, but you don't appear like that. And then for them to realize that I'm vulnerable just like they are, I think it encourages them to be real.
You just said something else again, and I'm like, this is what makes being a siren powerful, and it's the power of vulnerability. If we go back to the responsibility, not just being loud, and you really have something to say, it's because you have a vulnerability underneath that you're really trying to put out into the world.
You care.
You care.
Because I did realize a lot of people who keep silent is because they don't really care.
Yeah. So do either of you have somebody that, and I'm not thinking a celebrity or anything, but maybe somebody in your life that carved that path a little bit for you? I know you talked about your parents.
My dad especially.
And your dad especially.
Oh, I wish I wasn't my dad's daughter sometimes.
But, anybody you can think of that as well, and maybe it is a public figure, somebody that stands out to you in this sort of, they're someone who speaks the truth, who also has that vulnerability that you also builds the trust in what they're saying. So I don't know, anyone have anyone that come to mind?
Well, one of the women that really, really impressed me, but I don't know as much about her as maybe I should have, is Dr. Maureen Sabia. She received a Doctor Honoris Causa at Dalhousie in 2014, and I was there on the platform when she delivered her speech. And for me, coming from Romania, having English as a third language, speaking up, being seen as, outspoken, Maria always, speaking up and always having something to point out. Many times I felt like what we say in Romania, the black sheep, like standing out, but not in a positive way. So when I heard Maureen Sabia, she basically spoke my language. Like I had tears, and I realized that despite her very different background, she was a very different generation, very different country, everything different. She was speaking very much the same language. Mm-hmm. And then through time, I realized that, because at some point I have to say I lost my faith in humanity for all the personal experiences I had. But then life gave me people who are very much alike. And I may be influenced because I just came from a vacation trip in PI and I visited the Lucy Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables and all that. So, the notion of kindred spirits.
Yes.
Well, they exist. And that gave me confidence. Maybe, that not everyone is a kindred spirit, but those 2, 3, 4, 5, how many there are, they make it worth it. For me, Maureen Sabia, she actually said something that I use as a quote on my social media. I just love it. And it's still one of my favorite quotes. Keep your hearts of gold, but make sure your spines are made of steel.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. Hearts of gold, spines of steel.
Yeah, Maureen Sabia.
Wonderful.
So your quote kind of tweaked something for me. I would say for me, when I was getting education and going through school, I had the very good fortune of having some really incredible teachers that really nurtured me along and I built a lot of really good relationships with. And one of the things that she had taught me from a very early age was to really think about life and experiences as golden links in the chain of life is one of the things that she had taught me. And that was from a very early age. And I'd say that throughout even my career, I've had some really incredible mentors. And I've just really been always the kind of person who's very curious and very open to learning and to feedback. And that kind of stuck with me from an early age all through my career. And the kind of neat thing is that those are still some people that I'm still in touch with that are still in my world today. And I think that's pretty special. So I think that as you go through life, sometimes you, I could use your term kindred spirits, but sometimes you come across people that really leave an impact and really help shape you, both as the kind of person you become and leader.
With that, my goodness, we could continue this conversation probably for another hour, but I'm going to leave us and these kindred spirits with this thought about embracing your authenticity and making sure that you speak up, especially when it's uncomfortable, because you never know who you're going to be modeling. So thank you both for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Wow, kindred spirits indeed. What I can share about these two individuals is that there's so much more to who they are, what they can do, and their brilliant minds that I could possibly share in half an hour on a podcast. But if you want to learn more, you should check us out at finclusiveedge.com. We are a Halifax-based community built all around financial technology for good. And if you want to hear more of what they have to say or find out what we're doing, just check us out online. Thanks so much. Keep jamming, and we'll see you next time on the Disruptive Jam.